Okay, guys, when we left off last time in the first part of the lecture, I was talking about how Hitler launched his blitzkrieg attack on Western Europe in the fall of 1939, and I made the point that at this time, FDR knew that the United States had to get involved in the war, but that American public opinion was categorically isolationist, but that by the time early 1942 rolled around, about a little over 2 years later, all that would have changed. We would not only be in the war, but way in the war. American public opinion would have done a complete 360. We would be just completely dedicated to the war effort, beating the Germans, beating the Italians, beating the Japanese. And the question is, how did we undergo such a transformation? Okay? Well, in order to make sense of that, we've really got to kind of turn the clock backwards about 20 years, almost 25 years, and go back and talk about, the World War I hangover combination bad vibes bum out after effect. And if any of you guys are Big Bang Theory fans, if that sounds like the title of a Big Bang Theory episode, it does. It just occurred to me that it does. It wasn't intentional, but it really does sound like the title of a Big Bang Theory episode. So, okay. The big one, as they called World War I at the time, started out as just another European war in 1914. But by 1917, it had become the biggest and most destructive war in human history, and the American people wanted no part of it, period. What's it got to do with us? Was the prevailing attitude of the average American. Let them blow themselves to smithereens and good riddance. Nothing but Euro trash. And truth to be told, it didn't have much to do with us. We declared ourselves strictly neutral. We traded with everyone. We loaned money to everyone, although we traded more to the Allies than we did to the Central Powers, and we loaned a lot more money to the Allies than we did to the Central Powers. So right from the start, it could have been argued that we weren't strictly neutral then, were we? We really sort of were on the British and the French, the Allied side, right? Because let's face it, guys, the side that you loan more money to, you really kind of have a vested interest in that side winning the war. So you're not really neutral. You're kind of on that side in a way. Yeah, right? Anyway, we were sort of just watching the war from the other side of the Atlantic, like the Super Bowl on a really big screen TV on the other side of a big living room. But then the German submarines kept sinking our ships. Because we kept sending so many of them over there into a war zone. I mean, hello. And then the Zimmerman telegram happened. And then we were in the war with a big speech from our president about how we were going to seek peace without victory and make the world safe for democracy. And not long after that, we got into the war. And the Allied side won, and not because we were so great, but mainly because both sides were so exhausted. And we were like a big Happy Meal with a super boost of PEDs and a Red Bull topper for the Allies. Just what they needed. Not to mention all of our supplies, industrial power, and none of it going to the Central Powers now at all. All of it going to the Allies, yeah. So the war was over, and we rolled into the 1920s, which, if you recall, were roaring for us. Happy day, and life was good and okay. But wait a minute, what's this? During the late 1920s, some interesting exposés were published in leading national magazines. Exposés that intimated, that hinted around at, hell, that downright shouted out loud that our agenda in getting into World War I was maybe not so pure after all. Maybe it wasn't about peace without victory and making the world safe for democracy and keeping Mexico from invading the Southwest through an unholy alliance with the Germans. And maybe all of that was just a bunch of hooey, actually. See, the thing is, the investigative journalists who published these pieces had dug deep and uncovered a lot of dirt, alleging that merchants of death, the term that became popular for weapons manufacturers, they had manipulated President Woodrow Wilson into leading the country into war. In fact, they had dug up enough dirt that in 1934, Senator George Nye of North Dakota spearheaded a congressional investigation into the whole matter. And while Nye's committee fell short of actually uncovering a smoking gun that definitively showed a connection, it nonetheless revealed enough evidence to convince the public and Congress that the United States should have never been involved in the Great War to begin with. And in the following years, Japan and China fought over Manchuria, and Italy invaded Ethiopia as the Germans built their war machine to strengths never even imagined. Congress decided that they were going to take no chances on another president, especially this president, possibly the craftiest cat ever to prowl the halls of the White House, ever being able to pull the country into involvement in the wrong sort of war again, and decided to tie the president's hands behind his back by passing the Neutrality Act of 1935, and then, over the next 2 years, passing several more Neutrality Acts as events around the world gave them more and more reason for concern about how and where the president might be able to involve the nation in foreign conflicts. When you look at the language of the Neutrality Acts, you can see that each of them were very specifically reacting, not just to what was happening in the world at that time, but also referencing the past events that led to American involvement in World War I. So let's mull them over right quick here, okay? Now, number one, the United States may not sell arms to warring nations, okay? In other words, we're not going to sell any kind of weapons to countries that are involved in conflict, okay? Fighting anybody else. We're not going to contribute to that kind of situation, right? Okay? No, this actually should be where number 2 is. I got my numbering goofed up there. Whatever. Number 2. Americans traveling on ships belonging to warring nations do so at their own risk. Okay? You know, back in World War I, Americans would get on a German ship or a British ship or a French ship, countries that were at war. They'd go traveling wherever. The ship would get sunk. The American traveler would die. The family would then come to the government and say, you got to do something. My husband, whoever that died, right? You know, okay, now the government would be thinking, nitwit, what was he doing traveling on a ship belonging to a nation at war? Traveling in a war zone most of the time. Yeah. Now we have to get dragged into resolving this situation because this knucklehead was, yeah. Okay, the government is now saying, we don't want to be involved in situations like that. Okay? So they're saying, Americans, look, if you travel on ships belonging to warring nations, you're doing so at your own risk. Don't come crying to us if you get involved in difficulty. Forget it. We're not going to get involved. Okay? Now, the third thing. The United States will not make loans available to belligerent nations. Belligerent meaning nations that are attacking other countries, that are making war upon other countries. Okay? We're not going to loan money to countries that are behaving in a warlike manner, attacking other countries. We're not going to loan the money. That's another thing that we were doing in World War I that got us into difficulties because, again, that we had a vested interest in those countries, like winning the war because we're loaning the money. If they lose the war, it's going to be hard for them to pay us back the money, right? Okay, and then last but not least, I don't know how I got my numbering so screwed up there. I'm the knucklehead. Anyway, warring nations, in other words, any countries engaged in conflict, must engage in a cash and carry trade policy with the United States. If you're engaged in war at all, being attacked or attacking, and you want to trade with us, anything, okay, you have got to bring your ships to our country to pick up your stuff and then go back home. We're not going to send our ships into your part of the world because your part of the world is a war zone. We don't want our ships sunk. We sent our ships into war zones all the time during World War I, and guess what? Our ships got sunk. And guess what? That's what dragged us into that war. Never again. Okay? So these are the neutrality acts intended to prevent the United States from getting involved in this era of conflict. Okay? It's not World War II yet. It's not, nobody's calling it anything like that. But there's conflict in the world, and we don't want any part of it. All right? But here it comes, the advent of World War II. So Congress feels better. The public feels better. Because we're not going to get involved in another war that has nothing to do with us. Really? But FDR and other sharp cats, they knew that this war was different. This war wasn't like the last one. And the world that existed after this one was going to be very different. They knew that there was going to be a new world order coming, and if the United States was not part of winning this war, then it could not be part of dictating the peace that followed, and that could not be. American prosperity and American power demanded that we be players in this conflict, and not just players, but primary movers and shakers. We simply had to be involved in this conflict, but how? Well, historians generally agree on Franklin Roosevelt as the most able, the wiliest, clever like a fox president of the 20th century. And if he didn't always get all of what he wanted, he'd get a lot, pardon my hiccups, guys, or he'd get a version of it. There were enough men in Congress who knew by March of 1941 that the Neutrality Acts were too confining. And he rallied those men to his cause and was able to get Congress to pass the Lend-Lease Act, through which England, desperate for war material, supplies, and weaponry, was loaned by the United States 50 naval destroyers, big ships that can blow up stuff, man, okay? 50 naval destroyers for 99 years. In return for them leasing to us a string of island bases down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean for the same length of time. To accompany Congress passing this law, FDR made a speech in which he proclaimed that America must become the great arsenal of democracy, and arsenal manufactures weapons. So he's saying the United States has got to become the place where the weapons are manufactured that will protect democracy. Okay, now let's consider a couple of things here. March of 1941, the Blitzkrieg of Western Europe happened. It was done by like October of 1939. So how long ago has that been? It's been about a year and a half. For the last 18 months, England has stood alone against the assault of Nazi Germany. This is one of the great stories of bravery, of steadfast fortitude, of human valor in the face of overwhelming odds. Okay, it's one of the great stories in the history of mankind. England's struggle to survive, okay, in the face of this unbelievable attack by Nazi Germany. But they did it for 18 months, okay? But they're simply running out of stuff to do it with. They're running out of planes, they're running out of ships, they're running out of anti-aircraft guns, they're running out of everything. They are not going to survive without American help. Okay, and that is why FDR pulls every string, pushes every button, acts like the Wizard of Oz behind that curtain, right? You know, working his magic to get the Lend-Lease Act through Congress. So he does this. What do we get out of it? We get all these islands in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, now here's a map. Okay, islands in the middle of the Atlantic. These islands are so small that they do not show up on this map, but they're out here from the North Atlantic down into the South Atlantic. How is it that England has these islands? Because 500 years earlier, during the great age of exploration, when the nations of Europe were heading west and discovering the Americas, England discovered a bunch of these little islands, claimed them, and still owns them, okay? Now, when I say that these islands are too small to show up on these maps, I'm talking, guys, these islands are like the size of Disneyland, okay? I mean, they're dinky, all right? I mean, if the islands were as big as Los Angeles, they wouldn't show up on this map. The scale is too large, and the islands are too small, okay? But the islands are just the right size to establish, you know, refueling stations for naval vessels, okay? They're just the right size to have little, you know, like 7-Elevens basically, where you can have, you know, fresh fruits and vegetables and water, okay, and fuel and things like that. You know, if you're going to be sending a lot of ships, like from the United States towards Europe, from the United States towards Africa, from the United States towards the Mediterranean. So people reading about this in the paper, you know, smart people are saying, you know, what do we need with a bunch of dopey islands like this anyway? I mean, are we going to be establishing bases and fueling stations because we're going to be sending hundreds and maybe thousands of ships this way? Like, are we going to be getting involved in this war in Europe and North Africa? Like, you know, what's going on here? Well, this is Roosevelt setting the stage for what he's going to try to make happen. He wants us in this war, okay? And he's putting the pieces in place for what he wants, which is our involvement in this conflict, okay? Now, the following month, that was March, this is April, an arrangement was reached with the governments of Greenland and Iceland for the United States to construct airfields and refueling stations on the southern shores of their countries. Okay, now they're not crazy about this to begin with. The first discussions, they say, no, we don't think that's a good idea. They're concerned that Germany is going to look at this and say, oh, so you guys are allying yourselves with England and the United States or something. They don't want Germany to be mad at them, okay? But then we talk to them and we say, look, guys, you know, you're going to have to pick a side here, okay? So, do you want to be on our side? Because when we show up, we're going to bring Superman comics, we're going to bring Coca-Cola, we're going to bring hamburgers, you know, and Hollywood movies, you know, John Wayne and things like this, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and the Marx Brothers, okay? Or you can be on the Nazi side, because when they show up, they're going to bring shiny boots and dirty looks and creepiness, okay? You know what the Nazis are like, right? Who do you want hanging around in your country? Nazis or fresh-faced young apple-cheeked Americans with Coca-Cola and Superman? And then they go, you know, maybe you're right. Okay, we'll take the Americans, all right? So they give in and they say, yeah. Okay, now here's our thinking. Our thinking goes like this. We're trying to save England from conquest by the Nazis. Because if the Nazis conquer England, how much longer will it take them to conquer Ireland? You know, the Irish are proud people and they're tough, right? And they say, we'll fight the Germans with both hands behind our backs. And and they're going to kick your ass in about 2 days, okay? And once they kick Irish ass, then what happens? They kick Icelandic ass the next day. And the Greenlanders the day after that, okay? And now Hitler has established a hopscotch game towards Canada, okay? And the invasion of North America, the bombing of Canada, and soon New York City, The invasion of the United States is not far behind. We don't want that. No. Okay? So the reason we want to establish an American presence in Greenland and Iceland is to create a preemptive strike against a German presence there. Okay? Now, after this, in April, later that month, we begin convoying supplies to the British, basically daring the German submarine fleets to attack our ships as we start going deep into the most dangerous parts of the Atlantic. Okay? So let's clarify what's going on here with the convoying. Congress had outlined on the map what they called the British Strategic Zone and the U.S. Strategic Zone, marked by this line. This was considered to be the dangerous part of the Atlantic, okay, where American ships should not go, okay? According to the terms of the Neutrality Acts, cash and carry. If the British want anything from us, they have to come all the way over here to get it and go all the way home. So, Lend-Lease. Anything that they're going to get from us under the Lend-Lease Act, and it wasn't just those destroyers, we're now supplying them with unbelievable, literally, hundreds of tons of supplies every month. But they have to come all the way over to us to get it all the way back. Every one of these little submarines represents a spot where German submarines sank ships. Okay, look at how far the German subs are able to range, guys, all the way down to the hump of Brazil, to the hump of West Africa, okay, way up here into Greenland. I mean, the German subs are everywhere, right? German subs are sinking lots of British ships, destroying enormous amounts of American war material that we're trying to get to England, okay? And the problem is the British have to come such a long way to get this stuff, and they have to go such a long way back. So convoying works like this. We send the stuff on our ships all the way out to this line. We meet the British like 65% of the way over. The British meet us here. Then we swap the stuff over to their ships, and they don't have to go so far, okay? The reason FDR is doing this is because he wants the Germans to attack our ships. He's trying to force them to pick a fight with us. Because once they sink even one of our ships, that could create the justification, the pretext that he needs to go to Congress and to ask for a declaration of war against Germany, which is what he wants. Okay? But at the same time, Hitler has issued strict orders to his naval vessels, which includes a submarine fleet. Under no circumstances were they to attack American ships, even if fired upon first, even if fired upon and sinking. Do not fire upon the Americans under any circumstances. 9. Okay? Go down to the bottom of the ocean like a proud German and die. But do not give the Americans any reason to fire upon us. Do not fire upon them. Period. The end. Okay? They don't want us in the war against them. Why? Because Hitler, in June of 1941, is launching something called Operation Barbarossa, which is his invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler is going to attack Russia. It seemed like madness at the time because his forces were already not only occupying and keeping control of Western Europe, but keeping the pressure on the British with his bombing attacks on the UK. Yet in spite of that, he chose a daring yet foolhardy course. He invaded the Soviet Union. In 1939, he and Joseph Stalin, the premier of the USSR, had formed the Nazi-Soviet Mutual Non-Aggression Pact, wherein they agreed not to attack one another. But Hitler was in great need of two major resources that Russia had in her possession: food and petroleum. Russia produces a tremendous amount of food in the Ukraine, the breadbasket of Russia, and they've got lots of oil. Okay, enough food and oil to keep his army running and fed for as long as the war might last. But here's the thing, guys, and this is Dave just telling you what's up. Okay, so you listening? I'm dropping a major pearl of wisdom on you. Okay, so dig it. Do not ever invade Russia. Ever. No matter what anyone tells you to do, don't invade Russia. No one knows the future. And you, yes you could end up as the person in charge of some European country someday. Stranger things have happened. If this should ever transpire, you never invade Russia. Why, you ask? 3 reasons. First off, the winters are too long and too cold, and being in the midst of them while trying to batter a Russian army into submission is not fun. Do you want to fight an army, any army, let alone a Russian army, in snow 6, 8, 10 feet deep? No. Second, Russia is too darn big, okay? It takes forever to march into where Moscow is located. And if you want to conquer Russia, you have to get a hold of the capital. You got to conquer Moscow, right? Third and last, it's not just that Russia is big, but the Russians are big. Okay? You saw Rocky, what is it, 3? 4. Rocky 4. Remember Ivan Drago? I will crush you. Right? That freaking, they're enormous. And there's lots of them. And when you invade their country, they take it really personally. They get irritated, angry. It's like fighting an army of polar bears in the midst of the worst winter you can imagine, and you're miles from nowhere, and they never give up. Look, let me put it to you this way. Frederick the Great, a German, named the Great because he was seriously freaking awesome at war, okay? One of history's greatest generals. He tried to conquer Russia, tried to beat them, failed. Napoleon Bonaparte, same level, maybe even better, okay, of greatness. French guy, right? Tried it, failed. Charles the 12th of Sweden tried to invade and conquer Russia more than once. And his defeats were so epic that Sweden gave up war forever. It's been centuries, more than 300 years, and they never did it again. Have you ever heard of a Swedish army, Navy, Air Force? No, right? Because they gave up war because Russia broke their hearts. What do you think of when you think of Sweden? Meatballs and IKEA, right? But not military strength. And why? Russia. Too big, too cold, too many gigantic Russians. In the several political cartoons following, you could think Theodore Geisel, who would later write children's books under the name Dr. Seuss. You see him here laying out his take on the German adventure in Russia. Hitler thinks it'll be easy. Russia is like a giant dinosaur, and Hitler has only gotten a hold of the tail. Hitler is like a taxidermist who thinks that he can mount Russia on the wall with his other trophies. And by the time this is all over, Joe Stalin is going to have eaten Hitler for dinner. Okay? Here he is, Hitler, walking on an endless roadway of dead Nazis to the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia, where there's a lot of oil located, right, with his empty oil can, all right? Here you see Hitler up here, right, beating, just like a caveman. He's beating the Russian dinosaur to death. The Communique says, the annihilation is proceeding according to schedule. He doesn't realize he's just beating on the tail. He thinks he's killing it. It's like a snake, right, with the tail up like the head. But in fact, here's the giant rest of Russia, right? Here he is, Adolf Hitler, taxidermist. He's got all the heads of his creatures that he's killed, stuffed, and mounted. France, Denmark, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., right? He's dragging in the great big monster Russia here. He doesn't realize what's waiting for him. Has no clue. And last but not least, here's Joe Stalin with the hammer and sickle of the communist flag in hand, right? With his roast Adolf like a pig with the apple in his mouth and the fork in his ass, right? Bon appetit. Okay? Dr. Seuss. Dr. Seuss. Theodore Geisel was his real name. This is before he was doing the children's books when he was a political cartoonist, but you recognize the style. Everybody read Dr. Seuss when they were a kid, right? I still read them occasionally. I pull out the Lorax like once a year or so. And I also love If I Ran the Zoo. But anyway, you dig it. Okay, now, in August of 1941, President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill released the Wilsonian, meaning former President Woodrow Wilson back on World War I, the Wilsonian Atlantic Charter, which outlined their shared version for the ideal goals of the war and the post-war world. No territorial changes made by conquest, national self-determination, the restoration of self-government to those people who had been conquered, a reduction of trade restrictions, very good for the United States, by the way, cooperation between nations, pardon me, to improve the living conditions for all peoples, freedom of the seas, an end to war, and the disarmament of the aggressor nations in the war. While the U.S. had not formally entered the war at this point, this nonetheless had the effect of placing us on the side of the British in the eyes of the Axis powers, if our actions up to that point had not already done so. Through the fall of 1941, we continued to supply the British and push the boundaries of German tolerance, essentially daring them to attack our ships. But as hard as we tried to pick a fight in the Atlantic, Hitler kept running away. He had no appetite for a fight with us on his western flank, while he had his hands full with the Russians on his eastern flank. And who can blame him? And the thing was, FDR knew that, inevitably, the U.S. was going to be in this war, and not just in the European theater of action, but in the Pacific theater of action against the Japanese. And he wanted the war to start with the Germans, because he wanted a free hand to make them the number one priority, since America's historic and economic priorities were far more closely tied to Europe and the Atlantic world than they were to Asia and the Pacific world. If somehow the war started with the Japanese, then he was going to be forced to make that theater of action the number one priority, and this he didn't want to do. But Hitler wouldn't cooperate. He kept running away. And the Japanese weren't making things easy on him either, because the more Roosevelt threatened them and tried to get them to back down and tried to stall for time, hoping that if he did so, Hitler would do something to start the war with the United States, the Japanese just kept pushing and pushing some more and then pushing a little more than that. They weren't interested in playing a game of FDR's that had them waiting to attack or be attacked, according to a timetable of his devising. They had their own plans. See, they needed resources for their war machine, remember? And bought a lot of those resources from us. And we were still selling the stuff to them, but in smaller quantities now that they were acting so aggressively. But everything they needed was out there, just beyond the lines that we and the European powers had drawn on the map of the Pacific. But now those European powers had their hands full on the other side of the world with Germany and Italy. And the only power in Asia that was telling the Japanese what to do, really, was the United States. Only we were standing between Imperial Japan and iron, rubber, oil, minerals, everything she needed to grow, expand, kick ass, take names, win, pursue her glorious destiny. And so the Japanese kept pushing the line and expanding a little here, a little there, and our naval intelligence tracked their fleet from Hawaii as it moved around the Pacific. And then in late November, we lost them. Lost their fleet out there in the vastness of the ocean, just Couldn't find them. Now remember, guys, this is not as hard to do as it might sound. No satellites. This is sending out planes to search, and the ocean is vast. So, yeah, the fleet was gone. And the big question was, where are they going to hit? The Philippines? Malaysia? The Dutch East Indies? Hawaii was not even considered. It was too daring. We underestimated them. But they did the same with us, and we know that they did, because we talked to their military leaders after the war, and we know what they were thinking, how they had underestimated us. You have to remember, the Japanese were a young power. And what I mean by that is that they had only become a great power in the world, an empire, in the last 40 years or so, before the war. And they looked at us as old, fat, soft, decadent, and lazy. From their point of view, we were roaring 20s enjoying, foxtrot dancing, Hollywood movie watching, hot dog eating, roller coaster riding, Babe Ruth loving, no good Americans. They thought we were done, just waiting to be kicked onto the trash heap of history. And they had formulated a very daring plan, like Hitler's with Russia, that, if it had worked, could have changed the history of the world. The plan, very simply, was a knockout blow at Pearl Harbor. Here's Pearl, here's Japan. Take out our aircraft carrier fleet, our fuel reserves, and our dry dock repair facilities. This would set us back 2 years, if we even came back from such a terrific blow, and they were not sure we would. And by that time, the Japanese would have conquered the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Australia, New Zealand, India. The greater Asian co-prosperity sphere of influence would be established, and at that point, what possible effect could the United States have upon such a magnificent creation, really? All we could do was sue for a negotiated peace and leave most of the Pacific to them. I mean, guys, if they'd been able to do this, the only place that our fleet could have gotten repairs done on ships and refueled would have been San Diego, which on the map, if the map was big enough, be like here. This is like where San Diego is. Okay? So think about that. Having to do everything here and then heading way out into the Pacific. Pearl Harbor is halfway across the Pacific. San Diego is on the far side of the Pacific. Okay? So think how much easier everything would have been for the Japanese to do all this stuff over here if we always had to go all the way back over here to get to the gas station, right? Or to get a tune-up, get repairs done, etc. But they screwed it up. On December 7th, 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor. The carrier fleets were out on maneuvers, so they failed to destroy them. They also failed to destroy our fuel reserves, and they failed to destroy the dry docks. Period. The end. They failed in everything that they set out to do. The story, and it's probably apocryphal, it's a great word that we got from the ancient Greeks. It means a story that's probably not true. It's a great story, but it's probably too good to be true. The apocryphal story is that when the full report had been made back to the Japanese general in charge of the attack, his reply was, "Now we have only succeeded in awakening a sleeping giant." On December 8th, the United States, the UK, Canada, and the Netherlands declared war on Japan, and 4 days later, Japan's Axis allies, Germany and Italy, declared war on the United States. Much of the rest of the world had been at war for the last 3 to 5 years. Now we, too, were well and truly in it. Okay, now there's a few more things we need to talk about here. First of all, some photographs from the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. This is such a great photograph. You know, it's to get it this large, got a little bit grainy, but any smaller, and I just felt like it lost, I don't know, the power. So this is what I settled on. But so just some fantastic photographs from the attack on Pearl Harbor. I have 3 great uncles that lived through that attack. All 3 of them injured. They were all in the Navy. Actually, I had 5 great uncles that fought in World War II. One of them killed at Guadalcanal. But anyway. What an amazing shot that is, right? God, how could you even catch that shot? Incredible stuff. And this is something that I take out of the timeline of sort of telling the story of how we ended up getting involved in the war. Just because I feel like it kind of interrupts the momentum of the narrative. So I took it out to make it its own just little sort of piece of information. The Four Freedoms speech. In January of 1941, President Roosevelt made his State of the Union address, and the theme of that speech was the Four Freedoms. In the speech, FDR discussed freedoms which, he asserted, should be enjoyed by people all over the world. He went on to talk about the actions of aggressive nations in the world and how their behavior posed a threat to democracy. He also stated that the United States had to help its allies who were defending themselves from these belligerent nations. The speech was made even as the Lend-Lease bill was being debated by Congress, and in proposing that bill to Congress, Roosevelt had stated that the U.S. would become the great arsenal of democracy, manufacturing and providing the war material necessary to save democracy in Europe and elsewhere in the world. The president also made an analogy, saying, if your neighbor's house is on fire, and he runs to you saying that his hose has sprung a leak, then you must loan him your hose, if for no other reason than his burning house could set your house on fire. Here FDR was trying to make it clear to the American people that if all of Europe fell to the war machines of Germany and Italy, then how long would it be before their attention moved toward the Western Hemisphere? The images you see here of the Four Freedoms were created by America's most beloved painter, Norman Rockwell, a household name because of the covers he painted for the Saturday Evening Post over the course of 5 decades. These paintings came out on the cover of the Post in 1943. The paintings were so popular that the government sent them on a national tour to museums around the country in order to promote the sale of war bonds to help finance the winning of the war. Ultimately, the tour raised $130 million in war bond sales. Also of note was the man standing up amongst his fellows in freedom of speech. This is a portrait of young Abraham Lincoln, transported into the early 1940s to serve the need of Rockwell's theme. The first important moment of young Lincoln's career came in 1846 when he stood up and challenged the rationale being used by President James K. Polk to try and persuade Congress to declare war against Mexico. Lincoln had only just been elected to the House of Representatives by the good folk of Illinois, but even as a young and untested member of the House, he had the personal integrity and courage to stand up and, in a polite and diplomatic way, imply that the President of the United States was a liar. Many in Congress felt that way, but it was Lincoln who exercised his freedom of speech that day. Lincoln was a powerful figure for Americans of the 1930s and 40s. Not since the Civil War had they felt so challenged in their security, what with first the Depression and then the outbreak of war in many areas of the world. There were many plays staged at this time, focusing on different key moments in Lincoln's life, and his words were featured on propaganda posters, such as the one which paraphrases Lincoln's famous statement from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where he made an ominous prediction regarding the future of the United States, saying, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." The Four Freedoms paintings were issued as prints, posters, and on more than one occasion as postage stamps. And here you see that. This world cannot exist half slave and half free. Fight for freedom. and then going backwards. Freedom from fear. If you go on the internet and you look this up and you enlarge the image, you can see that the headlines in the paper are headlines about the growing conflict in Europe. And you can read in the posture of the father here and the look on his face, his worry and concern over what's happening, and, his love for his kids as he and his wife, tuck the kids in, his fear over the future, and what's going to happen, and, wondering about the future of his children, and here you have this kind of classic American Thanksgiving dinner, right? The freedom from want, right? Freedom from the want of food, of a square meal, right? Freedom from hunger, basically. The freedom of worship, each according to the dictates of his own conscience. And then the freedom of speech. And here's Lincoln as a young man of the early 1940s. Lincoln only grew the beard after he was elected president, but before he took office, because his wife thought that it would make him look more presidential. So this is Lincoln as he might have looked more or less in the 1840s when he was a member of the House of Representatives and he took that stand against President Polk. And here's something kind of interesting, the power of the German subs or U-boats. I showed you this map earlier and the great range of German subs. Here you see a German submarine basically right off the coast of New York. Okay, the tremendous area of operations of the German submarine fleet was laid out earlier in the lecture. As far south as northern Brazil and the hump of West Africa, and even into American waters, where they were initially able to torpedo ships still at dock in New York Harbor, like the USS Normandy, which you see here to the right, on its side and foundering after a German attack. Can you imagine this? You could be standing right here, on the docks of New York City and just see a ship having just been torpedoed by a German sub, like right out here or something. Just freaking incredible. This is mind-boggling. That photograph's just stunning, right? Anyway, influencing hearts and minds, popular art in the war. There were many campaigns to rally the hearts and minds of the American people behind the Allied cause. In Hollywood, before and then during the war, movies were being produced that were either overtly pro-Ally. Well, that's a typo right there I have to fix. Such as Mission to Moscow, all about an American who finds out that the communists in Russia aren't so bad after all. Wait, is that it? That's like a double typo. I gotta fix that, sorry. Or more subtly encoded with anti-Axis and pro-Ally sentiments. Two strong examples of the latter sort of film would be Juarez and the archetypal classic Casablanca. One of the most beloved films of the history of the movies, and that rarity, an old movie that speaks just as strongly to modern audiences as to the moviegoers who saw it first in 1942. Casablanca has the largely conquered, yet still proud French. It has arrogant Nazis throwing their weight around. It has a half dozen of the most quotable and still most quoted famous lines in Hollywood history. It has the world-weary cynicism and inimitable style of Humphrey Bogart's Rick and the luminous beauty of Ingrid Bergman's Ilsa. But most importantly for our purposes, it has a message that transcends time and explains why college students in the 1960s rediscovered the film and adopted Rick as one of the heroes of the counterculture, and why the film is rediscovered by young people over and over again to this day. A message of personal transformation, a message that says that just one man, a regular guy, in the right place at the right time, can change the world. When Rick, the only American in the movie, aside from his pal Sam, the piano player, takes Ilsa by the arms and says, "I'm no good at being noble, but it doesn't take much to see that the problems of three little people don't amount to a hill of beans in this crazy world. Someday you'll understand that." Everyone watching knew what he was saying, that the concerns expressed by American isolationists were small indeed, and that it would take American intervention to save the world from fascism. If you haven't seen it, it's a life changer. I might have seen it 20, 25 times. Every time I see it, I love it more. Every time I see it, it reaffirms certain core values that have informed my life and that will inform my life until the day I die. It never fails to move me. It never fails to move me to tears. It never fails to make me feel glad that I'm alive. In addition to co-opting the efforts of the Hollywood movie studios behind the Allies, the federal government called the leading popular artists of the day into action, like with Rockwell and the Four Freedoms, to craft stirring images that would convince Americans that their duty was to freedom, democracy, and the world. As FDR had put it in 1936, 5 years before the American entry into the war, but he could see what was coming, this generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. To the right, the painting entitled Our Emblem, and in the following 3 images you see examples of N.C. Wyeth's powerful paintings, produced to stimulate the sale of war bonds in the service of financing the war effort. You could buy prints, like not posters, but about this big. You could buy prints of these images and other ones that Wyeth produced, and then frame them if you wanted to, put them up in your house. Anyway, the titles of the next 3 are in order: Forward, Soldiers of the Sod, and sod is fertile soil to plant crops in. Soldiers of the Sod, and we are on our way. So this is Forward. And this is Soldiers of the Sod. And this is We Are on Our Way. I like the great factories of America with Uncle Sam. I mean, there's that Superman, right? Saying like, we're coming, baby. Right? Bringing those guns, tanks, planes, everything you need. And we're going to be kicking ass and taking names, right? Awesome. Such an awesome image. And the power of the comic book. The kids needed motivating as well. They may not have been able to buy war bonds, and they may not have gone to see adult motion pictures like Casablanca, although there were kid-friendly anti-Nazi movie serials like Spy Smasher for them on Saturday mornings. But they read enormous numbers of comic books, and the creators of comics during World War II felt a patriotic duty to imbue their work with messages that practically screamed straight out at kids, the Axis powers are evil. Many of the comics featured demeaning and even racist caricatures of the Germans, Italians, and particularly the Japanese, rendering them even more abhorrent to the eyes of youngsters. And by drawing the line so firmly, this then helped to inspire kids to get behind the war effort by collecting cans, newspapers, and bottles and bringing them to their local collection agency, early versions of recycling centers, where they were broken down and reused to fuel the war effort. The following images make it plain. If Sergeant Fury, Captain Marvel, Superman, and Captain America are fighting them, then the Axis powers must be the bad guys. Never mind that if only Superman got involved in the war, it would be over in a matter of days, if it even took that long, right? But anyway, you get some of these images, right? And you can check this out up here. You can see Spy Smasher, Uncle Sam comics, the original Marvel comics with the Human Torch on the front. The original Human Torch, not the one in the Fantastic Four. But if you saw Captain America, the first Captain America movie, before he gets the serum, him and Bucky, they go walking into that like fair that night when they're out looking for girls or whatever, and they see that android in that glass enclosure, the original Human Torch in there, but not on fire. There's your nerd alert. I know way too much about comics, but anyway, long story. Okay, but anyway, there's a kid with like his super geek credentials, right? Dressed up like Cap with his shield and reading a Captain America comic with a look of, absolute serious intent on his face. I gotta love that. A quick aside, yes, that is Fury. Sergeant Fury, as in Nick Fury, as in the guy who's in charge of S.H.I.E.L.D., and all the Marvel movies and television shows that you love so much. Yes, he was originally a white guy. How was it he became a black guy? Well, you got to read the comics for crying out loud, because, guys, I can't spoon feed you and do everything here for you. Okay? You're going to have to do some of the heavy lifting yourself. Here are some Superman covers from when Superman went to war. And, once again, if Superman, was real and actually got involved, I mean, he could single-handedly just won the war, all on his own. But anyway, here's the Justice Society of America with Wonder Woman, Hawkman, the original Green Lantern, all involved, helping out, going over to occupied Europe, bringing the cornucopia of endless food for starving patriots, getting involved in the war effort. Captain Marvel, who originally became so popular that his comic actually outsold Superman, and then Fawcett Comics got sued by DC for copyright infringement on Superman, and they actually had to cease publication of the character. It's a long story too, but anyway, this is not Comics History 101. Dig this. Captain Nazi. You gotta love that. This is pretty groovy. Using some Nazi as a piano bench, right? Singing his anti-Nazi marching song. Pretty fun. Captain America #1, punching Hitler in the face. You gotta love that, right? There he is with Bucky. The original Bucky. Bucky was actually kind of a kid. He was like a kid teenager. He wasn't some kind of big strong guy like in the movies. And then here's this sort of horrible, Japanese caricature. But, hey, they were the enemy in the war. Nobody was complaining about racial stereotyping or anything like that. And then there's some characters that didn't really survive the war. You had the Defender and the Conqueror. And here's, the German mad scientist, like, the Wicked Witch of the West or something like this hideous gargoyle, right? Okay, now I'm not going to take you through the whole progress of the war in terms of battles and invasion paths and this, and that, but I included these two maps. This is a kind of first stage of what's happening in the war, and then second stage. You can kind of just look these over if you want to and sort of see what was going on, and I included them in your composite video and check them out, entirely up to you if you want to or not. Few images, Allied forces landing on the beaches at Normandy on D-Day in 1944. Very famous image of the Soviet flag being lifted over Berlin in 1945. You got the flag colorized there. I like this image with that colorization, so I included it rather than the original black and white. Again, maps that you can kind of dig in on if you like. This is kind of cool. The Battle of Midway, June 1942, just some really stirring images. The United States Navy, only 6 months after Pearl Harbor, broke the back of the Japanese fleet over 4 days of fighting near Midway Island. And let me just show you where that is, by the way. So here's Pearl, there's Midway. So at Midway, 4 days of fighting at Midway Island, and what renowned military historian John Keegan has called the most stunning and decisive blow in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese were never able to recover, and even though they would fight for more than 3 more years, from this point forward, they were slowly but surely losing the war. These next images are from the Battle of Midway. Look at that. It's shot from a plane, from a fighter. I mean, just like, how can they even get shots like this? Look at that. Just like, so awesome. It's like, just look at this right here. Like, it just catching that explosion. That, like, boy, holy cow. Look at that. Just, boy, my God. Again, another map you can mull over at your whim and whimsy. And then the last thing I'm going to look at here is the Japanese-American internments. There was tremendous racial hostility towards Japanese Americans on the west coast of the U.S., and especially in California going back to the time of the gold rush in the 1850s. In fact, the animosity was so strong that in 1907 the governments of the U.S. and the Empire of Japan arranged the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, whereby all Japanese immigration to the United States was prohibited, just totally cut off. After Pearl Harbor, it took very little time for this old and long-simmering prejudice to heat up dramatically amidst calls for the internments of those Japanese ancestry out of fear that their first loyalty was to the Empire of Japan and that they were a threat to the security of the United States. In February 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which would lead to the detainment and forced relocation of American citizens of Japanese ancestry to areas that were not militarily sensitive. This essentially meant removing them from coastal areas, the West Coast. It is important to note that not one piece of evidence was ever produced to point to even one Japanese American as a saboteur or a spy for Japan, which makes General John DeWitt's following statement that much more ironic. The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken. I said, say what? Now that's some logic. Almost, dare I say it, Trumpian logic. or alternative facts, right? He said that a year after the internments had begun. A year after all the Japanese Americans, or almost all of them, were rounded up and put into these concentration camps. Not one piece of evidence had been found to support the fact that any Japanese American had engaged in any sabotage, treason, spying. It's also interesting to point out that Japanese American college students were allowed to remain in school, and in Hawaii, which had been attacked by the Japanese, there were no concentration camps at all, no internments. People of Japanese ancestry were left entirely alone. Now, doesn't this seem to fly in the face of logic, right? No. The reason for this was that the Japanese and Japanese Americans in Hawaii were so essential to the economy, in particular the sugar industry, like they were the equivalent of Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Latinos in general in like Southern California. Okay, they did like all the jobs that Latinos do in Southern California. They were especially like the sugar industry that was 100% dependent on them, or 90%. Okay, it was simply impossible to subtract them from the labor force. So they were left alone, and again, guess what? Nothing bad ever happened at all. Period. The end. Finito. It's clear from this cartoon that Theodore Geisel was part of the broad majority when it came to the suspicion towards those of Japanese ancestry in the days following Pearl Harbor. Here he suggests that many Japanese Americans are nothing more than members of a fifth column, or secret spies or saboteurs lying in wait within the United States, waiting for the signal from home to do their dirty work. I can never really look at the Cat in the Hat, the Lorax, or Too Many Daves in quite the same way again. Have to be honest, ever since I found out about these political cartoons and read through them, and just very, I don't know, just kind of disheartening to find out that he saw things this way. I don't know. I don't feel quite the same about Dr. Seuss. Anyway, here's a map that shows you the military exclusion zone, the states and territories that had more than 1,000 Japanese residents, and the Japanese relocation camps. Okay, the nearest one to LA, which is where I am broadcasting from and where West LA College is located, is Manzanar up in Death Valley. And then if you ever head out Phoenix way, not too far off the main highway heading to Phoenix, you can catch, that's a weird choice of words, you can visit the camp at Poston. You can go to these camps. They've been preserved because of historic interest. I would say historic monument, but that seems like a weird... Historic landmarks is what they are, actually. They're specifically state historic landmarks. They're worth checking out. And if you live in the greater LA area, go to the Japanese American Museum in downtown LA and check it out, because they quite often have exhibits dedicated to the Japanese internments. And right now, as I record this, February 20th, I think it is the date today, of 2017, there's an exhibition going on that has to do with the Executive Order 9066 and the internments at the Japanese American Museum. It's going on for a few months, in fact. So worth checking out. Very much worth checking out. Anyway, here's a photograph of the Grenada, Colorado internment camp. Pretty grim, pretty drab, right? Pretty unappealing. A photograph from Manzanar, California. A family waiting to be sent off to their ultimate destination on one of the camps. Mealtime at one of the internment centers, right? Yeah, and then just read this and suck up that last sentence. They're free, of course. It's a grim chapter in the history of our country. Because they were citizens of the United States. Imagine if we got involved in some kind of a dramatic shooting war with, I don't know, the assembled nations of, the Middle East. I mean, think about the tension with Muslim Americans right now and Muslim immigrants and etc. I mean, what about internment camps for Muslim Americans? I mean, could that happen? Could it? Perish the thought. I'd hate to imagine that. But under this Trump, it's hard to imagine what couldn't happen. Anyway, guys, that's all for today. Thanks for being here. Talk to you soon. Hello? There we go.